You know, it's really an honor and a pleasure, a real privilege to be here in Sacramento once again, in particular here at SALAM. You know, those of you that may know me or know about my background, especially as Dr. Mutwalli Amr mentioned, this is my community. This is the community that I was raised with, the community that I grew up with. And in many ways, this is the community that brought me to the activism and the involvement, the engagement with Muslims. And so for that, I'm very thankful and grateful to have this invitation to come back. In many ways, this is coming back home to speak to you. Personally, of course, I want to talk and thank Dr. Mutwalli Amr for everything that he has done. He really has been a mentor, a teacher, and a friend over the years. And we've, even though we don't speak to each other very often these days, but in many ways, the work that he did initially in planting the seeds about Islam and Muslims, and myself and our family, was something that was really remarkable and important. I mean, really shaped how we see ourselves as American Muslims in this country. I even remember our initial talks that we used to have at SALAM at 65th Street, which was the old location before this was even purchased, this land here, and these buildings, of course, that we have, these beautiful buildings, the masjid and the center did not exist at the time. So I remember SALAM in those days. And it's really a testament to this particular community for all they've done in these years, that now that I come back after having been gone for all these years, studied abroad and worked elsewhere, and now to come back to Sacramento to see what has happened, all those seeds that were planted and the fruits that it bears today. So it really is a testament to Dr. Mutwalli Amr, Dr. Atif Wardani, for instance, the individuals who really started this institution. I also want to thank my former professor, who is here, Dr. Ayad Al-Khazaz, who really planted, in many ways, the seeds as a student. He was my professor at Cal State when I was studying, and it's always a joy and a pleasure to see him here. And so I thank him for coming today as well. This talk, in terms of the subject matter that we're covering today, is a very important talk. It's an important talk because it's an important conversation that Muslims should be having. And in some ways, it's a shame that we're not having this in a much broader and bigger auditorium with all of the masajids in this area, all of the mosques in Sacramento should be having this conversation, the conversations that we're having in this conference today. And I wasn't given a specific topic to cover, but what I plan to do today is to give a broad overview about my research on American Muslims, and then in particular this issue of security and national security and extremism that's often equated with Muslims, both here and abroad. And so I'll just share some of my thoughts about that, including some of the research that I've done in this area over the years. Now, many of you know that American Muslims are an integral part of American society. While there are many people who would say that American Muslims are a recent immigrant community that have just arrived in the last couple of decades, that would in fact not be the case. That people who know this community and know this history understand that American Muslims have been here since the very founding of this country. And it was President Obama just recently in his talk, just a few weeks ago, when he spoke at the Islamic Society in Baltimore, in a major mosque on the East Coast, and he spoke about the contribution of Muslims historically to the very founding of this country. Many of you may not be aware that 1 out of 4 black slaves that came to this country were Muslim. And so to deny the right of Muslims to be here would be to deny the history of this country. Now clearly many of those black Muslims that came here as Muslims had to give up their faith. But they came here as Muslim, and then some in fact retained their faith, and we see the growth and evolution of the African American Muslim community in this country that then continued to grow, as well as the Nation of Islam, which many of you are aware of, and the seeds that were planted across this country. So this is the history of American Muslims. Now we know also, of course, there were waves of Muslims that came to this country. The wave that came after the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, when Arab Muslims, for instance, came in the 1920s. Many of them came to Michigan, Detroit, Michigan in particular, where they settled. These are Syrian and Lebanese Muslims. And so you see Muslims coming over the years. Then you see immigrants continue in the 1950s after some of the immigration policies were changed and opened up the doors for immigrants from elsewhere. And you see Muslims coming from other parts of the Middle East, in Asia, in Central Asia, where Muslims then began to come in the 1960s and 1970s. And then, of course, you see the disruptions that took place in many countries across Muslim societies, where civil war and strife resulted in difficulties for Muslims, and those that could no longer stay in their homes, they then came to European countries and came to the United States as well. My own family came to this country right after 1980, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and our family had to flee that country, and we were fortunate enough to be able to come to America. And so we're part of that generation that came in the 1980s, and subsequently we see many Muslims have come and settled in this country since the 1980s. Now, statistically, it's true that the majority of Muslims, nearly 68% of Muslims, have come since the 1980s. But that is in no way to deny the fact that Muslims have also been here far, far before that, and that they've been integral to the very foundation of this country. Now, in terms of Muslims, the growth of this community is contested in terms of the actual number of Muslims. There's great debate about how many Muslims are in the United States. Many suggest, if you ask American Muslims, they'll tell you the number is around 8 million, 7, 8, 9 million. Some suggest as high as 10 million. Those studies or those numbers are not statistically validated. Even though it's a number that's often used, it's difficult to sort of statistically quantify exactly what that number is. Now, the Pew Research Center, which I've been involved with, the two major studies on American Muslims, there was a study in 2007 and then also another study in 2011. And they came up with a number of initially 2.5 million in the 2007 study, and then 2.75 million in the 2011 study. Now, that study, I think, in some ways underestimates the number, partly because of the methodology that was used to come up with that number. And so, if today they suggest it's 3 million, I think it's still low. But I think that 7 or 8, 9 or 10 million is too high. So it's probably falls somewhere in the middle. And I tend to say it's probably around 4.5 to 5 million is probably the accurate number. And I can go through in detail explaining why I think that's the case. Now, American Muslims as a community, is probably the most diverse religious community in the country. As we look around this room, or you see Muslims at this mosque or any major mosque, you see the tremendous diversity that exists with this community. It's a community that speaks many languages, a community that has many different racial and ethnic groups, comes from so many different countries that have come here and settled here, including, of course, the immigrant Muslims, African Americans that have been here for so long. Our own study, the study that was mentioned, was the first major study we did on American Muslims in the Bay Area, in which we surveyed and looked at the community for the first time. We did a 2-year study on American Muslims in the Bay Area. And in that study alone, we found over 50 countries were represented. You're looking at a community of about 200 to 250,000 in the Bay Area. That was the estimate we came up with. About 200, 250,000 Muslims in the Bay Area. Yet over 50 countries were represented. Now we know that the majority of Muslims in this country tend to fall into 3 categories. There are South Asian Muslims, the Arab American Muslims, and the African American Muslims. So those are the 3 major communities of Muslims. But, as I said, there are Bosnian Muslims and Fiji Muslims, Indonesian Muslims, European Muslims, African Muslims, and South American Muslims, Mexican, Latino Muslims. You see that the diversity across the board, there are so many. Nearly every country, you could say, is represented in this country, those Muslims that have come here. So it's a tremendously diverse community. Now this community, of course, has also done remarkably well. The 2007 study that we did with Pew, the title was American Muslims, Moderate and Mainstream and Moderate, was the title of the report. And as you look at this community, you see that it's done remarkably well in terms of their education levels, in terms of their income levels, very high. In fact, the study that we did in the Bay Area, it was remarkable that the income levels were higher than, of course, the average nationally, but they were even higher than Americans in the Bay Area. South Asian Muslims in particular, nearly half of South Asian Muslims in the Bay Area have household incomes over $100,000. And so you're looking at a wealthy community. Now, one has to also keep in mind that there are major caveats to that. So you have African American Muslims that their income levels are lower, and in some cases, in average with African Americans generally in the Bay Area and across the country. Afghan Muslims also, as a subsect or a group within Muslims in the Bay Area, tended to be low in terms of their income levels. That also applies to education. But overwhelmingly, as you see though, Muslims in this country have done remarkably well. These are suburban Muslims. I mean, this is a suburban Muslim community in the suburbs of Sacramento. And Muslims that come here, and you know better than I do, they're Muslim doctors and Muslim lawyers, they're Muslim professionals, they teachers, and they do professional work, and they've done remarkably well for themselves. So in fact, as you see, the Muslim community of the United States, just like here in the Bay Area or across the country, and I've been involved with many of the studies across the country, it's the same story, that Muslims have done really well. Especially if you compare Muslims here to Muslims in Europe, for instance, where income levels in Muslims in Europe is much lower. You're looking at a very different demographic makeup, as well as the motivations of why they came to Europe. It's a laboring class in Europe, and therefore income levels are lower. Education levels are lower in Europe. American Muslims have done much, much better. Now, because of that, Muslims have also then integrated into American society in a way that has been less the case among European Muslims. And so when you look at studies in terms of questions about integration, American Muslims have integrated. Some have even suggested that integration has led to assimilation, where their identities as Muslims has sometimes even been given up, where names have been changed from Muhammad to Mo, for instance. And so you see Muslims that have in fact given up that identity. But the majority of Muslims have integrated. Integrated in a sense where they feel very confident and comfortable in their identity as Muslims, and very comfortable and confident in their identity as an American. And they see themselves. And when we ask in these surveys, how do you identify yourself? And we've had focus groups that have asked these questions. They say, well, I'm an American, I'm Muslim, I'm Egyptian, I'm a male, I'm a lawyer. And therefore, these identities have many different layers. One can't then just pinpoint it to one thing. All of these identities apply to these individuals. And they see themselves as fully comfortable with all of these identities. So the vast majority of Muslims are integrated Muslims. They've done well for themselves. They see themselves as proud Americans. They see themselves as proud Muslims. They contribute to the community within the mosque. They contributed to charitable organizations. They're giving back to their society. One of the questions that came up, we asked, how often do you volunteer? You would be surprised to hear that American Muslims on average volunteer and give more time than any other religious community. It's a community that gives back. And so this is a community that has not only done well for itself, but has given back to society. But that's what Islam asks of us. And that's what many Muslims have done. But yet within this context of a community that is giving back, a community that is integrated, a community that has done well economically and educationally, you also see the tensions that exist for American Muslims. And you see the tensions that have more recently, of course, become much more pronounced. The kinds of language and rhetoric used against American Muslims is a language we haven't heard and seen before. The kind of language that you hear from individuals that are running for the highest office in this country. The candidates running for president. Individuals like Donald Trump, for instance, or Ben Carson. The kinds of things that they have said go against the very fabric of what this country was made on and built on. A country that appreciates our faiths and our diversity. And it was President Obama that just suggested this and said this in his speech at the mosque in Baltimore. But yet this tension exists. And this tension against Muslims, more recently, and in the last couple of years, is things that we hadn't heard before. You wouldn't hear these kinds of things from President George W. Bush, or President Bush Sr., or President Reagan. Even Mitt Romney, who was running at the time, wasn't saying these sort of things. You did hear it occasionally from individuals like Herman Cain, who was running, for instance, or Rudy Giuliani. But it wasn't as pronounced from the candidates at the top. But today you're hearing it from the candidates at the top. So that has changed. And there's a certain allowance for that that we have allowed it to take place. Now, what that has done is it has begun to alienate a community that sees itself as integrated, a community that sees itself as American, but yet a community that sees itself under a microscope and sees itself always under suspicion. That you have to watch what you say, and you have to be careful about what you do, and you have to be careful about how you practice your faith. Muslim women are taking off their headscarves. It's not a good sign when Muslims can't practice their faith. A poll that was taken just last year among Americans, 56% of Americans hold a negative view about Islam. 56% have an unfavorable view about Islam and Muslims. Just 4 years ago, it was 47%. You're seeing a 9% rise in animosity against Muslims. Republicans in particular, when asked the questions about, do you think Islam is at odds with American values and way of life? 76%, that's more than 3 out of 4 Republicans in this country said yes, Islam is at odds with American values and our way of life. White evangelical Christians, 73%. White working class Americans, 67%. In fact, the majority of major Christian religious groups and denominations said that Islam is incompatible with American values and way of life. Catholics, 61%. Black Protestants, 55%. Those that consider themselves politically independent, 57%. Democrats that are more accepting and accommodating, it's 42%. So it's lower, nearly half when you compare it to Republicans. But overall, all Americans, it's more than 1 in 2. 56% feel that Islam and its values are at odds with America and American way of life. That's not a good sign. A community that has integrated and sees itself as American is now seen with suspicion. And of course, part of this is because of the rhetoric that we see at the highest level. If the top candidate says that Muslims are not welcome into this country, or somebody says that I do not think that a Muslim should be a president of the United States, what message does that send to our youth? That you are not welcome, and that you don't have the same rights that somebody else does. And consequently, those views perpetrated at the top then begin to filter down, and you begin to see it. It then gets projected not only in towards the animosity towards Muslims, but then actual violence and attacks against Muslims, were the kinds of attacks that took place after September 11th. And the height of post-September 11th period, when attacks against Muslims were very high. But yet President Bush went to the mosque in Washington, D.C. and said Islam is a religion of peace and Muslims, American Muslims, should not be targeted. That's what was needed. And consequently, you saw attacks against Muslims went down. And for a decade, they continued to go down. But yet now you're seeing them rise once again. And now you see the attacks against Muslims go up. And of course, within the context of what we're seeing globally, whether it's the attacks in Paris or the attacks in San Bernardino, that then only fuels this animosity. That this community is a community that cannot be trusted, this is a community under suspicion, and that we have a right to attack them. To the point where 1 out of 3 Americans, when asked, do you think the civil liberties of American Muslims should be curtailed? 1 out of 3 said yes. That yes, 1 out of 3 had said that Muslims should not have the same rights that other Americans do. That's a remarkable number. So that this whole notion of about Americans being treated equally, and doesn't matter how you practice your faith or what faith that you have, but to suggest that American Muslims should not have the same rights that others do. And that then translates. And I have all the statistics and numbers in terms of people that have had suspicion acted against them. 1 out of 3. Been called offensive names. 1 out of 5. Been signaled out in airport security. 1 out of 5. Been singled out by law officers. 13%. Just over 1 out of 10. And been threatened and actually attacked, 6%. And so you see that what is then said, it begins to translate into actions. And that's why we see the attacks against Muslims increasing. Because individuals say, look, if Donald Trump can say it, then I should be able to say it. And I can even act on it. And that's the scary part, that this atmosphere then begins to change. Now, why is this important? Well, it's important because of the broader context and conflict that we're dealing with when it comes to questions about terrorism and national security and extremism, about how we deal with terrorism, and how we deal with groups like Al-Qaeda and groups like ISIS, or Daesh as it's known. How do we fight these groups? How do we deal with it? And how do we make sure that American Muslims living in this country aren't susceptible to being influenced or seduced by it? That's a question that is very important. And those individuals that are here, including the law enforcement officers and those from the FBI that are here at this conference, this is what they have to do. And this is the task that they're given, is to respect the rights of American Muslims, but then also make sure that we find out those that are the rotten apples and try to identify or deal with them. The Muslim community has to accept that there are some Muslims in this country that are a problem. And poll after poll that's taken, clearly American Muslims have very moderate and mainstream views. The Pew studies that I mentioned, you see, they're moderate and mainstream on all topics. But yet then you also have a small percentage that is more radicalized and has extreme views. And we've asked these questions in focus groups about why do you have these views? And one then has to understand, and that's sort of a more complicated question about where those views come from. But still the point is that it exists, and it exists within our community. Now, the reason I bring this up, because the broader discussion about whether American Muslims are welcome in this country or not then directly impacts those that are more likely to be susceptible to radicalization or extremism. Because there are many motivations for why somebody joins extremist groups. I have a list of the reasons why somebody joins extremist groups. I'll just list a few of them. The major reasons why individuals join extremist groups, especially among American Muslims and Western Muslims in general, is because of the question of identity and a sense of belonging. And do they belong? And what is their actual identity? And that is a question that comes back to, do Muslims see themselves as American, and are they welcomed as Americans? That's the major motivation for individuals that don't see themselves, when they don't see themselves as American and don't see themselves as belonging, especially when their parents may have immigrated and they still aren't quite sure where they're from and how do they see themselves. The more that they are alienated, the more those individuals are susceptible to sort of the seduction of more extremist views. And there are other reasons that individuals are motivated. Some are motivated for status, others for revenge, others for some type of redemption, to erase a past sin, others for just pure financial reasons, others for thrill, others for ideology, others for a sense of justice, and then finally some just for death. These are 9 different motivations of why somebody joins an extremist group. The very nature of why somebody joins is very complex. There's no way that I could go into detail. It would be a conference of itself to talk about motivations. But the point is, it's a very complex process of what goes through somebody's mind to join a group and be one who is likely to be susceptible to it. And we can go into detail about what one could do to address that, and how do you bring Muslims back, those that are radicalized, how do you de-radicalize them, or how do you make sure that your kids are not susceptible to it? One of the major sources, and we spoke about it earlier at this conference, is the question of the internet and getting information from the internet. When they don't have legitimate sources or information from scholars and people that they trust and respect and people that they see as legitimate, they go elsewhere for answers. And they turn to the internet. And it's a very dangerous world out there. And you see all of these things about what's happening on Twitter and other social media sites where individuals are enticed to come to Syria or Iraq. Now, I should just say that American Muslims overwhelmingly have rejected it. In fact, even if you compare American Muslims to European Muslims, 5,000 Muslims in Europe have gone to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS. In the United States, it's been 250. So it's a small number, but still, why have 250 gone? And why have others shown some sympathy towards it? That's a question that we as a community need to ask and find out why that happens. Why is it that a 15, 16, 17, 18-year-old kid would want to do that? And in fact, if you look at the surveys, the vast majority of them are in their early 20s. So this is a young group. These are the youth that are susceptible to this and being radicalized. So we as a community need to really understand this and work to address this issue. That's a responsibility we have. And I think a conference like this is very, very important because it's a conversation we should be having. But of course, it's within this broader context, I said, which is very, very important. And many of you understand the rhetoric against Muslims today. And so, I don't have much more time. I think I've gone way over and past my time. But I will stop there. I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts on this important issue. Thank you.